Hi guys. So I picked the book "The Soil Will Save Us" by Kristen Olson. The reason I picked this was mostly because of the recent pandemic made me really think about the insecurity of my food sources, and I just wanted to get a better understanding of where everything comes from, how everything is produced. So this year I've spent a lot of time actually working on that. Food preparation in general, as well as gardening and that type of thing. So this was very fitting for where I am in life right now. So get started on this presentation. So as I said, the book's name is The Soil Will Save Us by Kristen Olson. Um, so a little brief overview. So she says that years of tilling and digging up the earth has released a lot of carbon into the soil, out of the soil into the atmosphere. And she says that repeated tilling of soils actually kill the natural processes that rebuild the soil. So all the microbes and everything that are in the soil end up dying because when you till, it basically kills all the food for the microbes. Um, Also, one of her main points is that by implementing natural farming processes, farmers have been able to find better yields with less inputs. Inputs being fertilizer and water and just general care, really. I found a couple of quotes in the book that I thought were particularly interesting. Um, the first one here is three great issues that we have today are biodiversity loss, desertification, and climate change. And the guy here, Alan Savory, makes a point basically saying that we're we treat each of these as separate issues when really they're one and the same. Less biodiversity really causes desertification and climate change just because we're not we're not doing we're not caring for the earth the way that the earth would naturally progress in itself. Another one was we think of Mother Nature as a machine. We assume we only need to remove or change one cog to fix a problem. We often find that we incur an unintended consequence that is often worse than the problem. So, like for example, one thing was we use insecticide or pesticides or something like that, and it kills off um, a type of insect. And what ends up happening is we lose a lot of insects, and then we don't even have the insects that pollinate our plants and such things like that. So it's more of a system than that we don't really pay attention to. And then another interesting quote that I found in the book was, "This was the moment when I realized I need to retrain my sense of beauty when it comes to farming." And this really has to do with um, traditional farms. We think of all our crops in rows with corn and beans and such, and it all looks pretty, and we think it's nice and it works well. But really, nature works best with biodiversity and all of these um, items really in a tight knit natural environment. Uh, so she kind of starts off the book with looking at traditional farming and explaining what traditional farmers do. So, traditional farming involves turning over the soil every year to start with a clean field. This is to get rid of any waste that was left on the field, say like the roots from the previous plant and maybe the stems after they cut it off with the harvester or whatnot. And that's just a normal thing that every farmer typically does. But really, what happens is plowing rips apart crucial underground networks of microbial fungi, and shatters the soil aggregates that hold water and gases in the soil. So really, when the plants put their roots down and um, basically microbes start growing in there and and it starts its own little ecosystem. And generally, it's really good to keep that that ecosystem working with itself. But typically, we just plow everything under, and it looks great from the top, but really it's killing everything that had been there over the course of the season. Soil samples show that fields have been worked for centuries. Soil samples have shown that fields have been worked for centuries have very low carbon levels. So this is saying that if you look at like the Middle East and Africa and some of these places where we know that the population has been for a long period of time, basically these fields are super low on carbon levels. So you can tell that as these guys have been working it, or these people have been working it for, hundreds, if not thousands of years, and pulling up the soil, all the carbon dissipates from the soil and is released into the atmosphere. Whereas if you look at relatively newer fields, such as like in America or anything that's freshly plowed, you can see much higher carbon levels just because the carbon hasn't been exposed to the atmosphere as much. Another thing is no-till cover crop farming is considered old school. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, what no-till and cover crops are. But everybody thinks that we need new technology to be able to survive and thrive and be able to build on our civilization. There was an interesting quote. This farmer, Abe Collins, said, once chemical agriculture came along, you didn't need any skills. You don't even have to know how to be a farmer. So what he's referring to is basically the new way of farming is all about getting information from your seed provider, and they tell you exactly how much fertilizer you put on it, how much water you need to give it, and they guarantee such an outcome. And it's not really maintaining the land, it's just basically just doing whatever the seed producer actually says to you. I don't know if this matters, but I'm going to move my screen into here so maybe you can see it. All right, moving on. So what is no-till? So we kind of talked about no-till in the past slide. So it kind of starts out with this chop and drop, which it has to do with basically cutting down any foliage that is growing and leaving it on the ground so that it decomposes and provides a habitat for bugs and microorganisms and food for that whole habitat basically on the ground. It also involves using a different planting method. So instead of the traditional kind of disc with a seed following or a seed dropping into a groove basically made in the ground, it's more of a drill a hole and put a seed in kind of procedure. It's different procedure mostly because no-till, the ground is usually a little bit harder than when you till up the ground a bunch of times before you plant the seed in. Slightly different process. So as I kind of mentioned, it keeps the habitat for insects and microorganisms active. So if you think about all of the residue, the plant residue from the previous crop or anything that you had chopped and dropped, it would be sitting there. That's going to stay as food for insects and microorganisms so that they can maintain life while you're in between different crops. One of the statistics that was given was that some fields stay empty, just bare dirt for up to 7 months out of the year, which isn't very productive, and it's just you kill all the food that can be for these insects and microorganisms that could be producing more nutrients and just adding value to the soil, really. So this rancher, Gabe Brown, He's from North Dakota, so he's been doing no-till for quite a while now. But he has been able to produce 127 bushels of corn per acre, which is actually 27 more bushels than the average in that county. And he doesn't even use any fertilizers, pesticides, or fungicides. So I thought that was an interesting statistic. Just by doing a more natural type of harvest or growing, he's able to keep the nutrients and keep the soil health up enough so that he can actually produce that much more. I mean, that's actually quite a considerable amount when you think about the percentage wise. So that's an interesting fact. So cover crops, that's another thing that was heavily focused on in the book. So cover crops are crops that are grown in off season when the field is not growing normal production crops such as corn or wheat. So generally it's types of grasses, legumes, and other plants. So legumes and clover naturally add nitrogen back into the soil. So just as if you were to grow a cover crop of legumes like beans or something like that and clover, and then just do a chop and drop and just leave them there, they add the nitrogen back into the soil as they're growing, but then they add value as they decompose on top. They can also control erosion and retain moisture in the fields. There was a very interesting point made in the book about how back in 2012 there was actually a drought in the United States, and the algae plume in the Gulf of Mexico had actually decreased in size because there was that much less runoff from the farm fields that particular year, which I find amazing that in an area as vast as the Gulf of Mexico, they could actually measure the algae plume and say, oh yeah, this year we make that measurement and it's considerably less. So that seems like a very interesting thing and a great reason to keep your cover crops. There was also another point made in the book that about how as people develop their soil health, it can retain a lot more moisture. And like the one particular guy in the first year, he could only retain like half of inch rain over the course of an hour. But after year 5 or 6, it was closer to 8 inches of rain, which it's a tremendous tremendous amount of improvement when you think about that, especially when we talk about how much flood damage costs, especially in highly populated areas nowadays. It really would help us in general. Let's see here. So also there's a benefit of cover crops that they can break up the soil for other plants. So they were talking about what they generally try to do is how, like if you look at the rainforest, you have trees of different heights so that they have their own kind of like ecosystems and layers. They try to do the same thing with plants. So like the ryegrass has really long, deep roots. So they like to plant rye so it can get the penetrating roots a lot deeper. And then there's other varieties with shorter and medium-sized roots, and basically they all work together to kind of loosen the soil up and help retain that moisture. And it really kind of iterates how nature works, where they don't have just a monoculture with one type of grass or one type of weed or whatever you might have in nature. It's a bunch of different varieties spread out throughout the field. Let's see. Okay, so we're going to talk about how cover crops are actually beneficial. So if you look at the Dust Bowl back in the 1930s, it was actually a very big deal. Not only did they have hard times because of Great Depression, but basically what they call sod busters were out just trying to till fields and try and just plant as much as they could to try and make food, make money. And what ended up happening was they had so much wide open space that wasn't covered by any type of ground cover. that when it became really windy, it would bring these giant dust clouds, and it would engulf whole communities, and it would affect people's respiratory systems, and it was just a bad deal, just because the ground wasn't covered anymore, and all this dust was just floating all over the place. Also, cover crops add the biodiversity to the fields. So, kind of like what we were saying before, was that these microorganisms that are in the ground, and the insects and everything else that kind of works in harmony, they like that biodiversity because they have different nutrients from different plants, and they have different habitats from different plants, and when they die and are laying on the field. So cover crops add that biodiversity. If you're planting on a field of corn next year, you can add that biodiversity in kind of in the off season and still have that the residue, the nutritional value, or not nutritional value, but like the residue from those other plants that keep that biodiversity around in that field, and you're not just straight corn every year. Also, I thought this was kind of an interesting quote. Weeds growing in your garden is nature's way of telling the farmer they don't have enough biodiversity. So you hear that all the time from gardeners about how, oh, I got to go weed my garden, and this is kind of nature's way of saying, hey, you need to go back and look at what you're doing. You don't have enough diversity, and we need to, try and get a little bit more microorganisms going in there. And I can totally see how that is that's beneficial, to keep some diversity in there and keep the microorganisms happy by having that diversity. So I just thought that was a funny quote. Also, by growing properly selected cover crops, specific nutrients can be added to the soil, therefore less fertilizer is needed. So, like we had stated earlier, the legumes, they produce a lot of nitrogen and store a lot of nitrogen in the soil, which is great for a lot of, it replaces a lot of fertilizer. Like one of the major ingredients in most fertilizers is nitrogen. So that definitely helps with that. So that's, we also have some more benefits. So I guess I kind of stated that earlier. The roots from the cover crop feed the microorganisms in the soil. Again, we're talking about ecosystem under the soil, and kind of its own food chain of these microorganisms that we can't really see what's going on, but they have their own system underneath the ground, developing or depositing nutrients, and that basically their waste under the soil to help the plants grow. Let's see. By keeping plant life growing in the fields, farmers maintain a habitat of insects as well. So I kind of touched on this already. Currently farmers use a lot of pesticides to target specific types of insects, but it could also kill its predators. And so there's a lot of they're just like from the world that we can see, the say birds and general wooded or forest animals, they all have their own other species up the food chain that are attacking them. Basically, the same thing is true with insects. So, for instance, there's particular breeds of insects that attack specifically wheat plants or specifically corn plants. But some of these farmers have found that by doing stuff such as the cover crops and keeping a larger variety out there, that there's other insects that will eat these specific insects that hone in on their wheat or their corn. So they found benefits from that. Also, by using the insecticides and stuff, you can eventually evolve your pests into super pests, kind of like what we were talking about with the specific pests that hone in on corn and wheat. Let's see here. So another issue that was talked about in the book was issues involving livestock. So this guy, I'm just going to fast forward because I can't remember his name, Alan Savory, he was professionally trained for figuring out how to keep soil healthy, specifically in Africa. As we know, everybody thinks of Africa as a big desert, basically. So he's from Africa. He's developed a couple of theories over there, and it's very interesting. I have the link to his TED Talk, which I had actually watched a while ago, actually before reading this book, and it's very interesting on his thoughts. But we're going to go back to, so it was thought that these cows and the livestock basically was what killed land, just from having the cows on there eating the grasses and grazing on the grasses. But basically what has happened is this Alan Savory, he kind of developed a theory that what's actually happening is, since we have wide open pastures, these cows and other livestock, basically they graze, they're not concentrated enough like they were back in times before they were domesticated. So what's happening is they eat just what they want, and they don't, and they're basically, their poo is kind of spread out over a big field and not concentrated. And he talks a lot about how he likes it when all the grasses are laying down, and so they're either eaten or they're trampled by the cattle. So he says that's what's best. So so his theory and what he promotes is that basically, like, farmers set up their grazing fields with smaller paddock type areas. So they keep their cattle in smaller, tighter areas. So they act like they were when they were natural, when they would basically, like back in buffalo, when buffalo roamed wild in the West, they would be in tight-knit groups trying to protect themselves from predators. So he's trying to emulate that by having these herds in a tighter knit paddock area, so that basically he would monitor it, make sure that they eat as much as they normally would, and to a particular level in that field, and make sure that they basically defecate enough in that particular paddock. And then once they get to a certain point, he determines, okay, we move on to the next one. And then he repeats that pattern so that they don't concentrate too much animal waste, and they don't eat too much of the grass. But by having that animal waste down there, and by them eating just enough and trampling enough, basically they have a great environment to regrow new grass and make better soil and actually capture more carbon out of the atmosphere as they regrow. So it's this, like I said, if you're interested, this Alan Savory TED Talk is really good. Otherwise, if you just look him up on YouTube, like I said, I watched it a while ago when I got into my gardening hobby, and it was very interesting. Not extremely applicable for Wisconsinites, I guess, but it's still an interesting theory and something interesting to learn about. Okay, so this was a interesting part of the book. It says about basically about what so what does science actually say about these particular strategies? So while farmers can see the results from growing natural and mimicking nature, it's harder for science to quantify these benefits. So generally, one of the points that she makes is it takes 3 to 4 years for natural solutions to be able to consistently outperform or be comparable to fertilizer heavy or water heavy strategies. So what she says is this is typically too long for traditional funded studies. So as you can tell, in 3 to 4 years, it's a pretty considerable amount of time to spend on a project. So that was, she said, for most universities and in situations like that, it's a little too long for them to be able to commit to. Also, there's a lot of variables, and just by the the nature of the beast, basically, that especially the Savory's strategy is you change your strategy each year depending on conditions, depending on rain conditions or how much cattle you have. And science really likes the change one variable, just change one variable. Let's see how that affects everything. And that's not exactly how it works. It kind of goes back to the quote at the beginning of the presentation about how basically we think it's a mechanical beast where we can, or not beast, but a mechanical system where we can change one thing and it should get into, that should help everything. And that's not the case, where instead we have multiple variables that we can change, and it's just hard to track, and scientists haven't been able to narrow down exactly what variables we need to change for what. Let's see. Oh, and then the next thing is, so most research money comes from big ag companies like Monsanto. Monsanto, it's a funny story about the first time I ever heard of Monsanto was actually their Neil Young song. If anybody's interested, I'd highly check it out. I'd highly suggest checking out. Neil Young and Willie Nelson have a thing called Farm Aid every other year, something like that, and they have a lot of interesting natural stuff and interesting side note. But anywho, the thing about it is when you think about if big ag companies like Monsanto, who sells seed and fertilizer and such, if they're funding the programs, most likely they're not going to be funding natural growing strategies, just for the fact that they're in the business of selling seed and fertilizers, right? And there's actually some of the big universities with these programs actually have like Monsanto Hall, or buildings dedicated to these big ag. I think ConAgra was another one that they have a whole building just for that company because they donate a lot of money to the program. So the research is kind of skewed in that way as well, and it's a little bit of maybe a little bit of what you want to call that, but it's a possibility that they most likely they don't have the general public's well-being. They're not looking out for the general public. They're looking out for the company, the shareholders, the stakeholders. So something that kind of could relate. So is soil science chemistry or biology? So this is a topic that she touched in the book. So generally, soil scientists are looking at the chemistry when they should be probably looking at the biology. That's her main point that she makes. So traditional fertilizer contains big three: nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus. Anytime you go to the store, buy some fertilizer, they're going to have three numbers on the front of the package, and they correlate to these three chemicals. That's what widely believed is going to make your plants grow the biggest, is just by having these three chemicals in your soil. And also, most soil tests are just based on these chemicals and maybe a couple other random chemicals. So a lot of soil science is based on the chemistry, not looking at how is everything working together and growing together. Looks like I kind of screwed up this slide, but so but she, in the whole book, she kind of adds a couple things of while there was a little bit of doom and gloom, she added some points to show that it's not all bad. So like something that I have thought about previously was, so we're obviously going through a time of great population growth through the last couple hundred years, right? But actually right now, current farmers produce about 4,000 calories per person per day. So according to the statistics she had in the book, that we as a society definitely put out enough food to keep sustaining the population that we have right now, and then some. But it's all about allocating You know, do you like, I mean, it's like other stuff that we talked about in this class. Do we allocate these calories to cows to be able to make meat, or how do we even get these calories to people in Africa that are in the desert that are starving? And obviously there's a lot of other situations there, but that number is pretty promising, really, when you think about it. 4,000 calories per person per day. It's double what we really need. So that's great. Another piece of inspiration, I guess, is there were lots of testimonials in the book about from farmers that had turned to these natural processes with much success. And it's not just the success that so I mean, one great thing from turning natural is they can actually sell their products for more. So if you have natural grown stuff, not necessarily natural, but organic, where you're not using fertilizers or pesticides or anything like that, you're going to be able to get a lot more money at the market. People are willing to pay for natural or organic grown produce. So that's definitely helping out the farmers in trying to change their decisions. And also, without having to put in all the pesticides and herbicides, fungicides, all that stuff, basically they don't have to spend the money on that stuff. So that it's really a double-edged sword. So they don't have to put as many inputs in, and they're getting more for their product. So it's really beneficial for the farmers to turn to this organic way of growing. But it takes a time commitment, and a lot of people don't have that commitment. Like we had kind of said, 3 to 4 years before you can see the turn where you're actually doing as well as or better than a regular crop that's fertilized, herbicide, fungicide, all that fun stuff. Also, there's many governments working on carbon credits and other programs to encourage natural farming. So one of the, besides government programs, there was also the Ducks Unlimited they had mentioned in the book. I didn't really realize what Ducks Unlimited was all about. I mean, I heard about their gun raffles and stuff like that, but in the book, they were talking about how basically the Ducks Unlimited was working with farmers and ranchers out in like California to keep some marshy areas, basically bring in cows once in a while, eat the grasses, fertilize, and just keep the natural process going. So it's interesting how some of these governments and other organizations are actually working together to try and come up with this natural program, because they realize that really nature has been doing this for the last a long time and humans just kind of started kind of pushing the buttons, you know. So yeah, basically it's hopefully we can kind of lean that way. So Olson thinks that if we switch to no-till and cover crops, we can sequester enough carbon dioxide to curb global warming. So that was a big theme in the book, was that she thinks that basically by converting to these more natural processes, we can change over the carbon from the atmosphere back in the soil. I can't remember the specific number. I don't think I have it written in my notes, but it was in the ballpark of 15 to 20% of all of the carbon in the atmosphere is there actually because of tilling up the land, not just driving your big V8 truck down the road, but just from humans tilling up land. I can't remember that exact number, but it was in that ballpark. So she thinks that if we can get back to that situation where we're growing plants, as we know, with photosynthesis, the plants using sunshine and water, it turns the carbon dioxide into oxygen. But while it's doing that, it stores that carbon inside the plant, and as it dies, it it decomposes into the ground, and that carbon is stored there permanently. So that was really the kind of the theme of the book, and the reason it's called The Soil Will Save Us, because she thinks that besides the fact that we'll be able to grow more and better food, will actually be able to help with the whole global warming issue. So my final review. I personally enjoyed it, and I enjoyed reading the book, and a lot of it probably has to do with my recent venture into gardening and taking care of plants and such things like that. So I might be slightly biased there. Um, so I feel like Olson did a lot of research in the book. She literally traveled the world, going to Australia, uh, Africa, North Dakota. I don't think that was too far for her compared to the other two, but she literally traveled the world to meet with these experts to be able to talk about these subjects in the book. And so I feel like she put in a lot of time, a lot of effort to get her facts straight. As I kind of talked about that, Alan Savory, um, I'd actually seen his TED talk quite a while before I read this book, so I feel like she reached out to find her subject matter experts to be able to make her points and um, back up her observations. Um, so I feel like she had a pretty good balance of showing the issues as well as positives. She made a lot bigger deal about the carbon credits and the governments and organizations that are trying to promote this in her book, but it was a little dry and boring, so I didn't do too much of that in this presentation to show that. But for the most part, she did a really good job of trying to balance it out, but just to try and keep it kind of upbeat and not too boring, I left a lot of that out. So I guess the one thing I have to say is I had a hard time criticizing much about the book, mostly because I don't have a biology background. The last time I took a biology class was 12 years ago, so I can't say too much about the technical stuff, but just from what I know about growing plants, or what the points that she makes really aligns with what I know and understand. So overall, if you're into gardening or anything like that, I would highly suggest taking a look at it. But yeah, it was an interesting read. So hopefully you got something on this. Hopefully it wasn't too boring, and hopefully I can figure out how to exit out of this. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you. Goodbye.